Today on In Good Faith, we're talking about people who are in Scripture and in multiple Scripture. And we want to hear different viewpoints. And we're so pleased to have Chris Hayes with us, Daisy Kahn, and Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. Daisy, would you just briefly introduce yourself?
I'm Daisy Kahn. I'm the founder of Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality, a nonprofit. But I'm also an author of several books, 30 Wives of Muslim Women, and Born with Wings, my own personal spiritual memoir, and Wise Up, Knowledge and Extremism. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Daisy. She was on episode 138 about her memoir, Born with Wings, and episode 263 about the book, 30 Rights of Muslim Women. Chris Hayes, please introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks. It's great to be here. I'm Chris Hayes, and I am a professor of Old Testament and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at Fuller's Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. So what that means is that I teach a lot of the context of the Old Testament and the surrounding cultures, and that also makes me fascinated in the many diverse cultures that we find around us in Los Angeles County here. And so I work on both ancient and modern topics. My most recent book is called The Widening of God's Mercy, and it's about human sexuality in light of the Bible.
Thank you, Chris. And Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, please introduce yourself.
My name is Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. I'm an author, organizer, activist, and I am the founder and principal writer at lifeisasacredtext.com.
Thank you. And Rabbi Danya is on episode 122, Making Amends in an Unapologetic World, which is one of her published writings. I wonder if we could briefly talk about Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar as they appear in your traditions, speaking of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. And maybe I'll go back what I think historically is the oldest and have you start, Rabbi, to talk about those characters as we know them in the Old Testament.
So in the Hebrew Bible, as we prefer to call it, in the Torah, book of Genesis, we first meet Abraham. And he is considered the patriarch, the big patriarch in my tradition. And he's from the land of Ur, which is probably Iraq, and is told to go forth from this place and winds up in the land of Canaan. Long story short, he and his wife, Sarah, are unable to conceive. And Sarah says to Abraham, here, take my handmaid and have a child, and this will be my child with you. This is often in my tradition downplayed. So in the beats of the story, we then see, as the Torah tells it, Hagar gets pregnant. Sarai oppresses her, and the word that's used for this oppression is the same word that the Egyptians later use to oppress the Israelites in the book of Exodus. And it should be noted that Hagar literally is Hagar, the stranger, and she's known as Hagar HaMitzrit, the Hagar the Egyptian. So she is the Egyptian stranger, and it's a very clear referencing to the stranger. You know, you were strangers in Egypt, we see, and so this is there's a lot of mirroring that we see in the text. So Hagar is the Egyptian stranger, and so she's pregnant. Sarah oppresses her. Hagar goes out into the desert. She is told by an angel not to worry about it, that she and her baby will eventually be taken care of. Out in the desert, she becomes the only woman in the Torah to name God. And then El Roi is the name, God that sees me, and the place gets a name as a result of that. And then Hagar goes back to service with Abraham and Sarah, and then has this child named Ishmael, God will hear. And then a chapter or two later, Sarah gets pregnant, has a child named Yitzchak, Isaac, and we see that around the time Yitzchak is getting weaned, Ishmael is playing, which is a wordplay on Yitzchak's name. He's mitzachek. Ishmael is playing. He's not playing with the kid even. He's just playing. He's being a kid. And Sarah says this child will not inherit, basically, and sends out and demands that Hagar be sent out into the desert to lose his birthright, to lose his inheritance, all of these things that earlier in the chapters she had said, this is going to be my child, right? This kid is legitimately entitled to. And so Hagar and Ishmael are sent into the desert. Abraham is absolutely passive here, just completely going along with this. Hagar is sent out into the desert. She doesn't have much in the way of food or water. She is despairing of what will befall them and weeping as she thinks that she and her child are going to die. And then God basically comes and says, no, don't worry, I've got you. Over here's the spring of water. You and your kid are going to be fine. And then she and Ishmael go and grow up in Egypt, off scene. Eventually, Ishmael comes back and buries Abraham together with Yitzchak, is the last thing we know about that.
Well, thank you very much for walking us through that. And Chris, as far as the Christian inheritance of the Hebrew Bible and other books of what Christians have as the Old Testament, do those pretty much track, or is there a different view?
I would say that you have different streams within Christianity. And as I went to revisit the Abraham story and thinking about the questions in this podcast, it really struck me how many different layers you have in the whole story and the different roles that Abraham has played. So the level of children's Sunday school, you've got Abraham as a father figure, Father Abraham had many kids. And then for those who are still growing in faith, Abraham ends up being this sort of symbolic, faithful person. He's called in Genesis 12, and he simply goes from his homeland and follows this call of God. He's the one who's willing to sacrifice his own son when he's asked to do so by God. But then as you spend more time with the story over the years, teaching it and thinking about it, he also has much more complicated roles. He's one who dares to argue with God. In Genesis 18, he says, shall the judge of the whole earth not do what is right, when he goes to destroy Sodom. And so his faith leads to even challenging God. And then so we get into these family stories also, in which Abraham is portrayed in such a more complex way. And this is all in the same context as the Hagar story, but we get these two paired stories of Abram sending Sarah into foreign courts to curry favor with powerful foreign rulers. And he's basically pimping out his wife for his own benefit. So he's a problematic figure there. And so we see a sort of lack of faith on his part. And the Hagar stories, it's an interesting tension, because he's told to send Hagar away, and God does care for Hagar, but at the same time, it's not totally clear that he's doing the right thing in that story. So, from a deeper Christian theological standpoint, I think that some of the complexities of Abraham's personality ends up being a sort of story of God's providence, that in spite of all the messiness of this family, that God somehow brings good out of it and lets the family survive. But from the standpoint of Hagar, it's a wrenching story to read as the mother and the son are sent out into the wilderness, into the desert, basically, and their lives are at risk. And I suspect, and when you talk about Christianity, you're not talking about one thing, right? You've got different branches of Christianity, and I suspect quite different ways of seeing this Hagar story. And the fact that Ishmael is viewed as sort of the forefather of Islam, I suspect that for, Christians of a more conservative bent, you've got him being sort of simply the unchosen one. But in my own mainline background, it's much more emphasized that God's plan is broader than just this one chosen family, that in fact God is working in all these different ways. So that's something that I find myself teaching in other texts as well, that we think that God only has one chosen people, but in fact, God has a plan for the whole earth and all the families of the earth. And it's said at the start of the Abraham story that through him, all the families of the earth are supposed to be blessed. So perhaps this is part of that promise.
Thank you, Chris. And Daisy, in the Quran, I wonder, does Sarah show up very much? And then I wonder if you would walk us through what the Quran presents as far as the journey and the life of Hagar.
Yeah, it's like a continuation of what's in the Genesis story, that Hagar is the wife, is considered the wife of Abraham. Abraham is considered a great prophet. His wife and him are childless, so they don't have a child. And the Quran shows Abraham beseeching God for a righteous offspring, grant me a child and let that child be among the righteous. And then the Quran responds and says, oh, we're giving you good tidings of a forbearing boy. According to the Islamic tradition, that forbearing of the boy is his first son, Ishmael. That's the difference between our Christian and Jewish narrative and the Muslim narrative. But then we get a little bit of the struggle of Sarah's childlessness and how she's, as what the rabbi mentioned, that she encourages Abraham to marry Hagar. So finally they have a family, and Hagar, then has a child, and now, her child is in the Quran name him Ishmael. And the Quran mentions that his descendants will be beyond numbers. So in other words, countless, you can't imagine the kind of blessing I'm going to give this son. And that's the beautiful part. When Abraham is 86 years old, his first son Ishmael is born. But then the story doesn't end there according to the Quran. The original promise that God had made to Abraham, that he would give him this beautiful son through Sarah, is eventually born. God makes it crystal clear that both sons do matter. He says that my covenant with Isaac is eternal, but Ishmael, I will make of him to a great nation. So we're talking about two divine promises, not just one.
And Daisy, because I know you've written about your experience with the Hajj, how do particular sites in that, when you're there, tie in with Hagar or Hagar?
Yeah. Well, the story is very beautiful because when this family dispute begins, Sarah doesn't want Hagar around anymore. And God basically tells Abraham to take her to a desolate valley. And as the rabbi mentioned, the young mother with the child, the father who's really kind of distraught. He doesn't want to do this, but he has been given a commandment. And so they wind up in this place called Becca, which is today's Mecca. And he leaves them there. And when he leaves them there, she turns around and says, are you just leaving us here with a bag of dates and water? And he doesn't answer. And then she realizes that he's following God's commandment. And she says, okay, then God will provide for us. So it's her conviction and her courage and her belief in God that allows her to stay there all by herself with a child. Eventually, the water and the bag of dates run out, and she's in a desperate hunt for water. So she's going up and down two hills called Safa and Marwa, and scouting, trying to look around for anybody, any sign of anyone coming forward. And no one's there. And after complete exhaustion, the child is, thirsty. And then Angel Gabriel comes with the tip of his wing, strikes the ground, and out comes this incredible, gushing, holy water. And today, this holy water is still running. So what happens at the Hajj is we reenact this whole experience. 2 million people go to Hajj every day, and over the span of a year, about 25 million people visit the sanctuary. And so the sanctuary that was built by Abraham and his son Ishmael together, because God commanded him to build a house of God where they could bring people to pilgrimage, basically celebrating God's oneness. So number one, you have that structure there which is, more than 4,000 years old. And then you have these two hills, Safa and Marwa, where Hagar went back and forth. And so Muslims to this day reenact that sacrifice that she went through. So they have to walk a mile up and down this, like what is now all indoor. And they reenact that sa'i, meaning the struggle that everybody has with their own self and the struggle that she went through. So it's ironic that as much as people say that, Islam is oppressive to women, here we are reenacting the sacrifice of a woman that lived more than 4,000 years ago. And then we also drink from the holy water, which is still running after 4,000 years ago. It has never dried up. It's amazing. So this is the story. But then eventually Abraham has that dream, that vision that he has to sacrifice his son. And the Islamic story goes that he's ready to do the sacrifice. And at the very end of the sacrifice, the son has been replaced by a ram. And at that moment, because of his commitment to God and wanting to do what God asked him to do, God tells him, now you will have a son. And so that's the son that's born to Sarah, the promised son. So it's after Ishmael. So this is a slight variation, but I think that if all of us have to think about the commonalities that we have with one another, I think we should think of the joint purpose why Hagar was brought into his life, the fact that there was going to be a second son, the fact that both sons, brothers, technically, and they both came to bury their father together, and we all come from the same lineage.
Daisy, how is Hagar thought of in Islam today, especially by women? Is this someone they look up to or venerate in some way?
Oh, I think that she's considered to be the founder of Mecca because she stayed behind. And it was her, where the well was created by her because her son was still young. She created the well. And then people saw birds flying, and then tribes started to come there because whenever there's water in the desert, there's life, right? And so she was managing the water well. And so the town developed around her commitment and fortitude. And then her son married into one of the families there, and an entire tribe was created as a result of that. So she is considered not only the founder of Mecca, which is the holiest site of Islam, but she's considered today a woman of courage, fortitude. I always tell women, if somebody told you that your husband had just spoken to God or had some kind of a vision, and tomorrow said, I'm taking you to Arizona, I'm dropping you off in a desert with scorpions and everything else because God has told me, would you actually do that? Would you do that? Would you believe in your husband who's so close to God? Would you do that? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves today, is that this woman's fortitude and her courage gave us the holy site, but also Islam, 2 billion people, followers. And the prophet was Prophet Muhammad comes from the lineage of Ishmael. So he wouldn't have been born there. Khadijah wouldn't have been born there. The town wouldn't have been what it is today. Extremely important.
Rabbi, I wonder, when I have seen in a local synagogue, I'm friends with a rabbi here, and he often will say, I'm so glad to welcome these particular new people into the people of Israel who have converted or are doing a bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, often adults. And he'll mention a name that they have, and I often see Bat Sarah or Bat Sarah for the woman. So I'm assuming that's daughter of Sarah, and is an honor to her. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about the position that Sarah has or how she's regarded by Jewish people.
Yes. In the Jewish tradition, Abraham and Sarah are considered the patriarch and matriarch of the Jewish people. Abraham was the original person brought into the covenant with God, and he got the name change from Avram to Abraham, and at the same time, his wife, Sarai, became Sarah. And so both of them got a hey in their name, which is a key letter in the most sacred, unpronounceable name of God. So that transformation is part of this bringing them into the covenant. And when someone converts to Judaism, their Hebrew name, instead of becoming their name children of their parents, is their name children of Abraham and Sarah, because they're retconned back into the the lineage. So traditionally, there is a lot of love for Sarah, and there's a lot to offer her, right? As Chris was saying, she was harmed profoundly in the story in Egypt, and there's a lot of analysis we can bring to her. And when we talk about the Hagar story, I believe that my people rush to bring apologetics when the plain meaning of the Torah text tells us a different story. And the lesson that we should be looking for is a little bit more about, we have an Israelite who harms an Egyptian, and then later we have Egyptians who harm Israelites. And Hagar is harmed, and then we are told many, 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 many times after we get out of Egypt that we need to protect Hagar, right, the stranger. It's not a coincidence, right? This oppression, the reproductive servitude, right, the enslavement and the reproductive oppression of Hagar, and then the subsequent oppression of her is in many ways the core story from which both that's the mirror of the Israelite oppression in Egypt, the Jewish sacred myth that is our own core story, and our greatest imperative to justice subsequently.
Chris, and again, I can't ask you to speak for all Christians any more than I can ask our other guests to speak for all Muslims or all Jews. But there has been an emphasis in Christianity on Sarah and that story, more than on Hagar, Ishmael, and those descendants. Looking at it from today and from what we know today, do you see that changing at all? Or I'm just wondering what messages you see people drawing from those stories.
Yeah, I was sitting here thinking about this as the other two guests spoke just now. And you're right that in Christian reception history of these two stories, that Sarah and Hagar have had quite different fates in Christian tradition. So Sarah happens to be the name of my sister, and it's a fairly common Christian name, whereas Hagar, I don't think I've ever met a Christian Hagar, which reflects the quite different ways in which they're treated. So I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I can tell you that in the books of Galatians and Romans, Paul uses this allegory of Sarah and Hagar as being this sort of faith versus works dichotomy, so that Sarah represents the new promise of the gospel, and Hagar represents the old, the flesh. And then again in the book of Hebrews, Sarah is held up as a model of faith, and Hagar isn't mentioned in this sort of pantheon of heroes of the faith. So the New Testament authors certainly favored Sarah over Hagar, and I think that in many strands of present-day Christianity, I think that continues to be the case. But I very much appreciated Rabbi Danya's comments about the need to take care of the sojourner in your midst, and I think that that's a very salvageable narrative and summons to all of us in modern faith today, because I think that if you read the whole Old Testament, that this concept of Hagar as an Egyptian is fascinating, because Egypt also gets sort of boiled down to being just the enslaving nation. But in fact, Egypt also has a fascinating range of roles in the Hebrew Bible and in the whole Bible. So there's much to commend this idea that it's a broader plan of God that we're called to live into, even in the way that we treat people who don't seem to have been part of the main story or the main promise of this patriarchal narrative.
Yes. And I wonder, Chris, a lot of people point to some sort of the competition between Ishmael and Isaac, or later Israel, as the source of all our conflict in the Middle East. And do we put too much weight on that, or is it just there's a lot that's happened since that folds into that? What do you think?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would definitely say that. And you do hear this all the time, that the Middle East has been at war and in conflict for 4,000 years or 3,000 years. And so it's all the same ongoing battle. And I really have to bring people up short if I hear that, because, we have so many different eras, and what we're seeing now in the present day, even though, yes, modern traditions claim these same figures, there's so much more water under the bridge, and we're not talking about the same entities now, even though they sometimes even claim the same name. So I just think it's a real misappropriation of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, for the purposes of trying to justify or trying to sanctify, tensions and frustrations in the modern day. I mean, I don't even know that that opens up a whole can of worms that I don't know how deep into that we all want to go, but I think it's an unfortunate way to use the Bible.
What inspires you about these different stories? And maybe inspiration is the wrong word. It could be inspires or teaches.
I think that what inspires me most in some ways, so there's a comment that Joseph makes later in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph says to his brothers, they meant harm, but God meant it for good. And I think that that's what's most inspiring to me, also, in spite of all the harm that humans are doing to each other in that story, that God is somehow bringing good out of that God keeps both of these family stories going, that God does, in fact, love all of these families, and so that, I think, is a testimony to the God that I think I worship. So that's what inspires me.
And I'm wondering, Rabbi Danya, the same thing. How do you think of those stories? Is there a modern story that's happening, or is it really just an automatic outgrowth of those past conflicts or what we read about?
So going back to the first question about are we playing out the Ishmael story, Yitzhak Ishmael today?
Yes.
That is a ridiculous statement. First of all, we don't ever see Ishmael and Yitzhak in competition in the Hebrew Bible at all. We see Ishmael playing and getting kicked out. And then we see Ishmael and Yitzhak coming together to bury Abraham. And everything else is happening on the level of the adults having issues and power and privilege and all of that stuff. Their issues. And second of all, Jews and Palestinians lived in perfect peace for centuries in that patch of land, under various empires and various folks. And, there's a lot of history and there are a lot of things to be said, but this narrative that Jews and Palestinians have been in constant struggle since the Roman occupation is profoundly ignorant. And I invite the people who think that to go learn some more history.
I'm wondering if there are ways that as we hear these stories, what approach there would be or way of thinking and reading about them that actually could be unifying for all the different Abrahamic faiths. What are the things in there that you think we could draw from that would be helpful? Daisy?
I think the one thing that we often miss from these stories is how central women are to carrying out God's mission. This was all planned by God. I mean, there was, if God just wanted to have Abraham have one son, he could have easily given him one son, as he did with so many other prophets. But, there was this deliberate attempt by God to create a second son and then to see how we all would behave, right? God tells us, I'm not making a distinction between the two of my sons, two of these sons that I've given you, right? Each one with a slightly different emphasis. But yet we make that distinction, and God does not make that distinction, and we refuse to acknowledge that both these sons were sent with a mission. But the mission would not have been carried out had it not been for the two women. Number one, they both gave birth, so that's very central to how God carries out his work and how women are co-stewards. And they wouldn't have been able to carry out Abraham's mission without the help of these women. So that's something that never really gets highlighted.
Yeah, that is a very unifying thing, I think, for all women and hopefully for men as well to consider that.
And it's a story of family too. I mean, this is what happens in a lot of families. Like you have a stepmother who cannot stand the stepson. I mean, this is like it's brought down to the level of human being, right? Like how human beings, they may be the wife of a prophet, but they still have the same issues. They're still struggling with, wanting my son to be the king and my son to have all the inheritance and not your son. I mean, but, this is the way we humans understand this. So I think it's interesting that we should be studying this from that perspective as well, and not just from the high level perspective that we usually study scriptures from.
Rabbi, I see you nodding. Do you want to comment on that?
I mean, yes. And I also think I often look at this story from the perspective of how we pass on trauma and what happens when we don't take care to look at the trauma that we're holding and sharing. Abraham does something horrible to Sarai in Egypt. And then we see Sarai do just about the exact same thing to Hagar several chapters later in terms of non-consensual reproductive servitude. We see Abraham potentially experience some traumatic things from his own family that he's then reenacting, engaging so passively with regards to trauma happening to his sons. And it's watching the imperfect characters in these stories is an opportunity for us to remember what's possible as we can care for each other and learn to love each other better. I think it also can remind us what we can give to each other when we want to be our best, and what can be when we want to show up and take responsibility for the privilege that we hold, who we can be when we want to be the ones to show each other the water in the desert, how important it is always. I mean, the core of the story is in her name, the stranger, and our obligations therein.
And Chris, do you see ways of using these stories in unifying ways, or seeing them in unifying ways?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that both of my fellow guests have spoken so well, so I don't have a ton more to add, but I would just say that I think that part of what these stories help us to realize is that we're prone as human beings towards tribalism. And I think that they ask us to pull back the lens and to widen our frame of reference and to think about the whole earth in the way that God does. And I think that's a helpful thing to do, but it has to be taught in the right way. Because I confess that the same materials, the same Bible that I think shows us this portrait of a broadly loving God also has tons of fairly tribal stuff in it. So we have to reckon with this, symphonic, complex Bible that we actually have. It's a big task for all of us who teach in the worlds of faith to think about. But I think it is something that we can pull out as teachers.
In just a moment, I think I'd like to ask each of you, just in preparation and thinking about this story, alas, what struck you that I may not know enough to ask you. But I do want to ask Chris, because you specialize in Old Testament from a Christian viewpoint. I know some Christians who look at the Old Testament as in, that was then, now there's the new covenant. We don't really need to go back. And they maybe sort of miss how often Jesus quotes the Old Testament as instructive and important. I wonder, how do we have people today who are Christians look back and mine the richness of the Old Testament?
Yeah, sure. And yes, of course. I mean, every time that I teach the introduction course, I have to, start again fresh and make this case. So I'm used to making it. And I would say that the first thing that I do is I hold up a copy of the Christian Bible and I show them that basically 3/4 of it is the Old Testament. And so as a Christian leader, if you can't make something of that, then you're going to have a very, weakened and thin type of ministry. And so there's so much in there, and it is there is this sort of supersessionist tendency within Christianity, this idea that after the fall or after some point in the story, it's all just sort of benighted, sinful people who are, struggling in the dark. And I just think that that's so, if that were the God who we worship, like what a cruel God like that would be to let this go on for centuries, with a people for whom there was no hope. That's a horrifying picture. Instead, I think what you see throughout the whole Hebrew Bible is this story of a God who is continually working with humankind in all these different fascinating historical situations and contexts. And you learn so much about the life of faith and the way in which we're called to live. And the Abraham and Sarah story and the Hagar and Ishmael episodes are just one of these fascinating vignettes that we get. So it's great to be here with you and talk about that.
And Daisy, thank you so much I think many people today don't realize how Abraham and Sarah and for that matter, Mary and Jesus and other religious figures figure into the Quran. I think there's a huge lack of education about the Quran. So finally, any kind of wrap up thoughts from just considering the story of Sarah and Hagar, Ishmael, Isaac that you have?
I feel like if I was to just take like a bird's eye view, I would say that in Mecca, you have the oldest religious structure. You also have the oldest religious ritual continuing on since the very beginning of time. And the reason I'm saying that is because it feels like it's supposed to be a reminder to us that we're all pilgrims on this earth. And we're all circling around something and hustling around something. I mean, life is a hustle. And then this is a reminder to us that we should make sure that there's something worthy of our precious and limited time, and that the journey is not, where it begins, but what we acquire from it. And certainly we saw that in Hagar and what she became. And as a result of her becoming and the town coming into fruition, look at the fruits that it bore. So we have to live purposefully and remember that our own pilgrimage is happening right now in our life. And that, to me, is a very big reminder. But the other reminder is where we can bring everybody together is the shared values that we have, right? In Hagar, we saw full conviction in her heart that she is not going to be left abandoned. God is not going to abandon her. And it's a level of faith that we could all use in our own lives, right? I find that completely amazing. And then when she was about to be swallowed by the entire valley, something miraculous happens. And again, God is always watching over you. And we should not allow our voices to be diminished. We should not allow ourselves to be shrunk. We should believe in God, and we should believe that God is there for us and is going to aid us in our moment, in our most vulnerable moments. I think that time is now.
Thank you, Daisy.
We keep talking about the Abraham Accord. We are actually desecrating Abraham by saying it's Abraham Accord, and then there is no substance behind it. There is nothing of the things that he valued, we are bringing to the table to help heal our wounds of bringing our people together and bringing people in the Middle East who all believe in Abraham. Well, okay, so where is the story of Abraham in this, When are we going to bury that hatchet?
Something that would really honor the name Abraham Accord, what would that be, right? If we're talking about your descendants are as numerous as the stars, right? Something that's going to hold and honor the children of Ishmael and the children of Yitzchak together in their shared holiness, dignity, created in the divine imageness. What would that be? I don't necessarily have the answers, but I think those are the questions that a future that everyone deserves should be asking. I want to bless us that someday we reach a future worthy of all of the children of Abraham and that honor them truly.
I've learned a lot. It has been an honor to be able to speak with each of you. You are each authorities in your own way. And actually deserve more time than we've been able to give you, but this has been really educational for me, and I know for our In Good Faith listeners. We've heard from Daisy Kahn, from Chris Hayes, and from Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. Thank you all so much for speaking with me today. We speak every week with people of different religious traditions and faiths. They don't all agree, but we find the commonalities and we're inspired by their search and their journey. I want to recommend another BYU podcast I think you're going to like. It's Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. It's brand new. There's video as well as audio. And if you want to learn how to engage with others on important topics, but maybe you don't know how, or you've just had it with social media and people arguing and demonizing each other, check out Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. There's a new one every Wednesday. You can listen or watch on the BYU Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.